Look up at the cross. Those 4 letters are everywhere. They're carved above altars, etched into stained glass, painted above church doorways in gold leaf that catches the afternoon light and makes everyone squint slightly when they look at it. Stamped into the wood of every crucifix that's ever hung in a Catholic classroom or a hospital corridor or a grandmother's bedroom wall. I would estimate conservatively that I have looked at those 4 letters 10,000 times in my life. I said their meaning aloud in Sunday school when I was 8 years old. I stood in front of teenagers for 35 years and explained what they stood for. Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudaeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. 10,000 times. I never once read it as what it actually was. Those 4 letters are not a theological title. They're not a devotional phrase. They're not a summary of doctrine or a poetic inscription chosen by pious hands. They are a Roman criminal charge, an official legal charge, affixed to a cross in a specific city, in a specific year under a specific Roman prefect, in accordance with a specific procedure of Roman criminal execution. A titulus, a charge placard. The same kind of thing that appeared at every Roman crucifixion, not above the prisoner's head as spiritual commentary, but as the court's formal record of why this particular man was being executed in this particular way. Rex Iudaeorum, King of the Jews. Under Roman law in 1st century Judea, claiming kingship without authorization from the emperor was crimen maiestatis, high treason. Not blasphemy, not sacrilege, not a religious offense, treason against the Roman state. The most serious political crime in the Roman legal code, punishable by crucifixion for those of low social status. The slaves, the rebels, the pirates, the insurgents. Not the philosophers, not the theologians, not the men who said the wrong thing about a foreign god. That is what INRI says. That is what it has always said in plain Latin, hanging in plain sight. I taught Roman law for 35 years, and I never applied it to those 4 letters. That is not a minor oversight. That is the kind of blind spot that happens when 2 things you know are kept in completely separate rooms, one labeled faith, one labeled history, and you never open both doors at the same time. Spinoza opened both doors. And what I found when I did is what I want to show you today. Let me tell you about the email. It came in on a Tuesday. I had been retired for about 4 years, still in the early stretch of my research, mostly reading Spinoza and trying to figure out what he was asking me to do. The email was from a former student, a sharp kid who had become a history teacher himself. He was in the middle of a unit on Roman Judea, and one of his students had asked him a question he could not satisfactorily answer. If the Romans ran Judea, why was Jesus executed for something the Jewish religious council accused him of? How does a blasphemy charge become a crucifixion? He emailed me because he thought I would know. Figured I had covered this somewhere in the 2 decades he hadn't been in my classroom. I drove to the university library that afternoon, Hodges Library at UT. I still had borrowing privileges from my years there for curriculum research. I pulled the gospel accounts, pulled Josephus, pulled my old copy of Ulpian on Roman criminal law, sat down at one of those heavy wooden tables in the reference section, the ones that have absorbed 60 years of coffee rings and pencil marks, and started reading. Cold fluorescent light overhead. The kind of afternoon where the library smells like steam heat and old paper, and there's nobody around to bother you. It took me about 40 minutes to realize I had spent 35 years teaching Roman history and never once properly read the trial of Jesus as a Roman legal document. I sat there for a while after that, not reading, just sitting with it. I called him the next evening. I said, "Your student asked a better question than either of us gave it credit for. The blasphemy charge does not become a crucifixion. The blasphemy charge gets replaced entirely before Jesus reaches Pilate. The replacement is precise, deliberate, and it reveals exactly how the system worked. That is what I want to show you today. Every Roman crucifixion had a titulus, a legal requirement, not a custom. The titulus was the official charge placard, publicly affixed to the cross or carried before the condemned during the procession to the execution site. Suetonius describes this practice. Cassius Dio references it. It was standard Roman criminal procedure in the provinces. The court's formal record of why this particular man was being executed in this particular way serving notice to everyone watching, from the Roman soldiers to the pilgrims walking by on their way into Jerusalem. When the titulus said Rex Iudaeorum, King of the Jews, that was not Pilate editorializing. That was the official charge. And under Roman law, what had been charged was crimen maiestatis, high treason, claiming a kingship that only the emperor had the authority to authorize. Now let me tell you what Rome did not execute people for, because this is the negative case, the thing that makes the INRI charge feel urgent once you understand it. Crucifixion under Roman law was not a general-purpose execution method. It was reserved for specific categories of offender. Ulpian, the Roman jurist whose work was compiled in the Digest, the great systematization of Roman law ordered by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, is explicit on this point. Crucifixion was for slaves, political rebels, pirates, and insurrectionists, men who threatened the order and authority of the Roman state, not religious offenders, not men who said the wrong thing about a god, not blasphemers. Rome governed a Mediterranean world full of gods, dozens of them. Egyptian gods, Syrian gods, Anatolian gods, all moving through the empire's religious marketplace alongside Jupiter and the official Roman pantheon. Rome was polytheistic and pragmatic. Provided you performed the minimum civic obligations, you could hold whatever private theological opinions you wished. A subject who claimed to be the son of a foreign deity was not a Roman legal problem. A subject who claimed to be a king was. There is a moment in the book of Acts, chapter 18, that illustrates this precisely. The Apostle Paul has been brought before Gallio, the Roman proconsul of Achaia, by Jewish accusers. Gallio's response: "If these are questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Gallio was not being dismissive. He was describing Roman institutional practice with precision. Jewish religious disputes were simply not his problem. His problem was political order, tax collection, the suppression of revolt. As Helen Bond argues in her study of Pontius Pilate, Pilate had been appointed prefect of Judea to keep the province calm and Roman authority visible, not to adjudicate theological questions among Jews. He was not a sympathetic figure trying to free an innocent man. He was an administrator, assigned to one of the empire's most volatile postings. So when the chief priests bring Jesus to Pilate's praetorium, they bring him to a man who is constitutionally indifferent to blasphemy. A man who, if they had simply repeated the charge from the Sanhedrin trial, would have told them the same thing Gallio told Paul's accusers: "See to it yourselves. I am not a judge of these things." They knew this. They had to know this. They were the political leadership of occupied Judea. They had spent years navigating the relationship between Jewish religious authority and Roman administrative power. They knew what got processed in a Roman court and what got sent back across the street. And when Jesus arrives before Pilate, what Pilate asks first is not, "What has this man said about God?" His first question is direct and institutional, the question of a prefect doing his job. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Not a theological question, a legal one. Luke 23, verse 2. Stay with me on this one. I want to read you the exact moment when the priests reach Pilate, because it is the most important single verse in this entire argument. More important in some ways than the titulus itself, because the titulus tells us what Rome ultimately charged. This verse tells us how it got there. "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" Read that list again. Read it slowly, the way you would read a legal document, because that is what it is. First charge, perverting our nation. Political insurrection. The Greek word Luke uses, diastrepho, means turning aside, corrupting, misleading a population. In Roman provincial context, it means subversion of public order. Not a religious offense, an insurrectionist charge. Second charge, forbidding us to pay tribute to Caesar. Fiscal sedition. Deliberately counseling the population to withhold tax from Rome. This is not just illegal. This is one of the most dangerous offenses a provincial subject could be accused of, because Rome's entire administrative structure in the provinces depended on reliable tax revenue. Tax resistance was existential to Roman provincial authority. It was the thing that turned a low-level disturbance into a prefect's personal crisis. Third charge, saying that he himself is Christ a king, not Son of God, not Messiah in the theological sense, Christ a king. Christos Basileus, a political sovereignty claim, a direct assertion of rival authority to Caesar's. 3 charges, every one of them political, not a single theological element among them. Now go back 1 chapter, Mark 14, verse 64, the Sanhedrin trial. The high priest has just asked Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" When Jesus responds, the high priest tears his clothes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they condemned him as deserving death. Blasphemy. That is the charge inside the Sanhedrin's walls. A theological crime, a religious offense against the holiness of God under Jewish law. That charge vanishes completely when they walk to Pilate's praetorium. Not modified, not translated, replaced. The blasphemy disappears. 3 political charges take its place, and every one of those political charges maps directly onto Roman crimen maiestatis. Spinoza's method, laid out in the Tractatus, chapter 7, is to read texts in their historical and political context, and to pay as close attention to what a text conspicuously leaves out as to what it includes. What the chief priests chose not to say to Pilate is as revealing as what they said. They knew Gallio's answer before Gallio ever gave it. So they rewrote the charge sheet. They took a religious conviction. This man has committed blasphemy. This man deserves death. And they reframed it in the political vocabulary that a Roman prefect was constitutionally required to hear. Perversion of the nation, tax resistance, a royal claim. 3 clean political charges, each one a genuine Roman legal concern. This is not a miscarriage of justice. This is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The priests understood the system. They used it. And when they said Christ a king to Pilate, they were not explaining what Jesus meant by it theologically. They were telling him what Rome would have to understand it to mean: an unauthorized kingship claim. Crimen maiestatis. The blasphemy charge required witnesses, testimony, careful religious argument about what constituted desecration of the divine name. The political charges required nothing but the claim itself. You do not need theological dispute for crimen maiestatis. You just need the king. The priest stripped the charge down to what Rome needed to hear and delivered it with precision. It worked exactly as designed. Now let me give you the context that surrounds the execution itself. Because the 3 men who were crucified that day, and the man whose release was offered as an alternative to Jesus's, are not incidental details. They are evidence. They tell you what kind of docket Pilate was working from that week. Barabbas. Mark 15, verse 7. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the uprising. The Greek word is stasis, a standard term in political and historical writing of the period for civil unrest, faction, insurrection. Not a word for common crime, a word for organized political violence against authority. Barabbas was in prison not for theft or brawling. He was in prison for political violence during an insurrectionary episode. He was, by Rome's definition, exactly the kind of man crucifixion was designed for. The Passover amnesty was itself a political instrument. Passover brought enormous crowds into Jerusalem, pilgrims from across the diaspora, people with deep historical memory of the Exodus from Egypt, already primed to think about liberation from foreign power. Messianic fervor ran high. Roman prefects in Judea maintained double or triple the normal garrison during Passover week, precisely because it was the most volatile period of the Roman calendar in that province. Releasing a popular prisoner was crowd management disguised as mercy, a calculated reduction of tension. Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas. Both men were being held on essentially the same category of political charge. Both were, from Rome's perspective, potential sources of public disorder in a volatile, occupied province during a dangerous week. Then there are the 2 men crucified alongside Jesus. Every Christmas pageant I attended as a child used the word thieves. two thieves flanking the cross. That is how generations of English-speaking Christians encountered them. Petty criminals, thieves, irrelevant to the theological event in the middle. But the Greek word in Mark 15 verse 27 is lestai, and if you have read Josephus, if you have read the Jewish War, which is the essential primary source for Roman Judea in this period, you know exactly what lestai means. Josephus uses it throughout the Jewish War and the Jewish antiquities to describe the armed bands resisting Roman occupation, the political bandits, the insurgents who refused Roman authority in the Judean countryside, the men Rome considered not criminals in the ordinary sense, but political threats, the kind of men who end up on crosses, not in ordinary jails. Richard Horsley documented this carefully. In first-century Roman and Jewish sources, lestai consistently denotes political rebels, men operating outside Roman authority in a political rather than merely criminal sense. Theft was a magistrate's problem. Armed political resistance was a prefect's problem. Jesus died between lestai, between political insurgents, not petty thieves. Josephus documents the pattern. Theudas, who claimed prophetic authority and led a movement to the Jordan River, was beheaded by the Roman procurator Fadus. Judas the Galilean, who led a tax revolt against the Roman census, was killed. The Egyptian prophet who gathered thousands at the Mount of Olives was hunted by Felix. Each one a messianic claimant, each one processed by the same Roman institutional machinery that processed Jesus. Kingdom of God in first-century Judea was not a purely otherworldly concept. It was a sovereignty claim, an alternative to the kingdom of Rome. In a province under occupation, proclaiming that God's kingdom was arriving was, in Roman ears, a rival sovereignty claim. The Roman prefect who heard it had one instrument for processing rival sovereignty claims. Jesus was not an anomaly. The system processed him the same way it processed the others. John 19, verses 19 through 22. Pilate has ordered the crucifixion. The titulus has been affixed to the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that the maximum number of passers-by could read the charge, so that pilgrims streaming in and out of Jerusalem during Passover week from every corner of the Mediterranean world could read it in their own language as they walked past. The chief priests go back to Pilate. They object to the wording. They say, "Do not write King of the Jews." But he said, "I am King of the Jews." Pilate's response, "What I have written, I have written." 4 words in Latin. Quod scripsi, scripsi, final, not negotiable. Most readings treat this as a character note about Pilate, a flash of stubbornness, a man reasserting himself after being managed by an angry religious establishment all morning. That reading is not wrong, but it misses the procedural dimension entirely. The titulus was the official legal record of the execution. Once the execution was underway, amending the charge would have been legally anomalous. It would have implied the original charge was uncertain, perhaps fabricated after the fact. It would have created an administrative record that raised more questions than it answered about what had actually happened in Pilate's courtroom. Pilate was not being sentimental. He was protecting the integrity of the official record. What I have written, is a bureaucrat's sentence, a man closing the file. Helen Bond is clear on this. Pilate's behavior throughout the trial narrative is consistent with a Roman prefect managing a politically complex situation. He is an administrator calibrating options, reading the crowd's intensity against the cost of a riot during Passover week, calculating the minimum necessary action. When the priests object to the titulus wording, their objection is itself revealing. They wanted, "He said, I am King of the Jews," which would have framed the charge as a defendant's claim rather than a court's finding. It would have put the sovereignty claim in quotation marks. King of the Jews without qualification was Pilate's formal finding. This man was, in Roman eyes, a royal claimant. The priests had needed Rome to process a religious threat. Rome had processed it. But Rome had also officially recorded in 3 languages what it saw, a king. And that was not comfortable to have posted publicly in Jerusalem during Passover week, when the city was full of people who might read it and think, yes, he was. Pilate left it there anyway, because that was what happened under Roman law. and the law said it stays. And this is where Spinoza comes in, not as the source of the argument. I had built most of what I have just told you from Roman legal history and the gospel texts themselves. Spinoza comes in as the person who understood 3.5 centuries ago exactly what it meant structurally, what it said about power, what it said about what happens when a religious institution loses the sword. John 18, verse 31. The chief priests have brought Jesus to Pilate. Pilate tells them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The priests respond, "We have no right to execute anyone." That sentence is usually read as a legal technicality. A jurisdictional note. Rome controlled capital punishment in occupied provinces. The Sanhedrin had lost its right to carry out the death penalty. Technical fact, moving on. Spinoza read it as something considerably more important than a footnote. In the Tractatus, chapters 17 and 18, Spinoza analyzes the relationship between religious authority and political power in Hebrew history. His central observation: in the original Hebrew theocracy, religious and political power were fused into a single governing structure. Moses held both, Joshua held both, the judges held both. But when a religious institution operates under a foreign political power, it loses the ability to enforce its own judgments coercively. It retains moral authority. It retains the power to persuade, to exclude, to condemn. What it loses is the sword. "We have no right to execute anyone" is not just a legal footnote. It is the priest's acknowledgement that they are in exactly the situation Spinoza describes. They have the conviction. They have the verdict from their own tribunal. What they do not have is jus gladi, the right of the sword. Rome took that when it took Judea, and without the sword the conviction is useless. So they borrowed Rome's sword. They took a religious judgment and converted it into a political charge that Rome was constitutionally required to prosecute. They did it with precision. They did it with institutional knowledge built over years of managing the Roman relationship. They did it in 3 charges that mapped directly onto Roman crimen maiestatis. Spinoza, and this is what I keep coming back to, understood this from the inside. He knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a community's judgment that could not execute you, but could cut you off from everything that made your life possible. The cherem and the excommunication the Amsterdam Jewish community issued against him in 1656 was exactly this structure in miniature. He was 23 years old. He had expressed philosophical ideas about God and Scripture that the community found intolerable. They used communal exclusion, social ostracism, commercial prohibition to execute a judgment they could not execute with a sword. He sat with that for years. He wrote the Tractatus in the long shadow of it. And when he read the trial of Jesus, he recognized the Sanhedrin's maneuver as something he understood not just intellectually, but in his bones. A religious institution operating under a foreign sovereignty, weaponizing the foreign sovereign's legal machinery against a man it could not touch through its own authority. The priests did not engineer a miscarriage of justice. They engineered an execution using the exact tools available to them within the constraints of occupation. The charge was incomplete in one sense. Jesus was not organizing an armed insurrection in any straightforward military sense. But the charge was true in the sense that mattered to Rome. The claim to a rival sovereignty had been made publicly in a volatile province during Passover. A man who lets himself be called King of the Jews in Roman-occupied Jerusalem is making a claim Rome's administrative machinery is designed to address. Pilate addressed it with 4 nails and a sign. Let me come back to those 4 letters. INRI. Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Iudaeorum. I have looked at them 10,000 times. I will look at them 10,000 more. They are everywhere, in the wood and the stone and the gold-leafed glass of every church I have ever entered. They will outlast every one of us, but I cannot unknow what I know about them now. The cross was not a religious symbol in 1st century Judea. It was a Roman execution instrument for political enemies, a machine for communicating state power and its consequences. It was slow, public, degrading, and calculated. designed to make the political lesson visible to the maximum number of people over the maximum number of hours. The Roman state used crucifixion the way a government uses a public execution, as a message to the living, not as a service to the dead. The sign above Jesus' head was not theological commentary. It was a criminal charge, filed in Latin, posted publicly at an execution site in 3 languages so that pilgrims from across the known world could read it on their way out of Jerusalem after Passover. The official record of why Rome had found this particular man worth killing in this particular way. INRI does not say he died for your sins. INRI says Rome thought he was trying to be king. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. Someone will hear this and think, you are trying to take the spiritual out of it. I had that conversation once in a grocery store parking lot about 2 years after I started doing this research seriously. A man I had known for a long time, a deacon at the church I had left, a genuinely good person who had never been unkind to me, not even after I stopped coming, saw me loading groceries and said straightforwardly, "Howard, I hear what you're doing with this channel. I think you're trying to take the spiritual out of it." I closed the trunk. I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I'm trying to put the real back in it." He did not say anything to that. We shook hands and went our separate ways. I do not know if it was the right answer, but it was the honest one, because what I found in that library is not less than what I had before. It is more precise. The trial of Jesus is not a story of a religious misunderstanding or a theological tragedy that happened by accident. It is a story of systems doing exactly what systems do. A religious institution without coercive power borrowing the sword of an occupying empire. A Roman prefect processing a political threat with the bureaucratic efficiency Roman administration was built for. A criminal charge that told the truth about what Rome saw, even if it told an incomplete truth about everything else. The church spent 2,000 years turning a Roman execution placard into devotional imagery. I understand why. Faith makes meaning from the facts it encounters, and the meaning made from these particular facts has sustained hundreds of millions of people through difficulty I have no standing to dismiss. I sat in those pews for most of my adult life, but we should know what we are looking at. The sign is evidence, documentary, contemporaneous, legally binding evidence of how the Roman state classified a man it considered a political threat. The charges that produced the cross were not the charges from the Sanhedrin trial, but 3 replacement charges engineered to work in a Roman court. We should know what Spinoza, reading the trial narratives in their historical and political context, could see clearly from Amsterdam in the 17th century. That a religious institution without the right of the sword borrowed the right of the sword from an empire, and that the empire left a record of what it did with it. What I have written, I have written. Those 4 letters, carved and painted and etched in gold above every altar I've ever sat beneath, are a Roman court's documentation of a political execution. That is the truth of it. Make of that what you will.